Hello, Lord Owen. Thank you. Please first allow me to thank you for accepting my interview, and we're very honored to have our first interview for Casual Politics with a personality like yours. And please first allow me to introduce you to our readers. I'm sure that they know you very well, but and you serve as junior minister under Wilson and Callaghan before becoming the Foreign Secretary in 1977, following Tony Crosland's death. And you went on to co-found and then lead the SDP in the 80s. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, which period was your most glorious time in your political career?
Well, I think the period I most enjoyed was being Minister of Health from 1974 to 76, 2.5 years. And I'm a doctor of medicine, as you probably know, and I'm a neuroscientist by training. And I think the opportunity to be in control of this vast budget and to be able to shift priorities and to choose areas for focus and for development was very exciting. And I was young. It was a big department in those days. It was the Department of Health and also Social Security. My boss was Barbara Castle, and she was much more interested in the pension side of it. So I was given a vast area of responsibility, and she was active in certain key areas, but other areas she didn't want to get involved in, things like smoking campaigns, abortion law reform. I also had a task to take what was called a private member's bill, involving adoption, guardianship, and dealing with very serious abuse of children. So it was called the Children's Act, and I brought that into a very big piece of social legislation. I brought it onto the statute book in 1975, and I think in terms of fulfillment, that was probably the most interesting. I mean, to give you about one example, the Chief Medical Officer of Health came to me, and the World Health Programme for the eradication of smallpox had run out of money. And we knew we had to track down, if we were going to eradicate it out of the world altogether, we had to track down the very last people suffering from smallpox, vaccinate people who've been in contact with them. And these were in the mountains of Eritrea. And we were not getting anywhere near enough activity. And so I found an extra $1 million for them.
Wow.
And then pounds, really nothing in the health service budget. Then they ran out of money again, and the only other government that was paying was Sweden, and I found $500,000. Well, that finished the eradication program, that made it able to complete it. And if you look on it, one of the miracles of the last few decades really has been the total eradication of smallpox. And now people don't have to be vaccinated, and the terrible consequences of smallpox in terms of blindness and many other very nasty side effects has been virtually eradicated in the world. So this is a small incident, but it shows you the range of activity that you have as Minister of Health dealing with your own country, world health problems and things. And although Foreign Secretary is fascinating and very enjoyable, in terms of feeling you've left a legacy, I think the health service is more important.
And do you think, since that you became the health secretary, what has changed in the NHS system?
Well, there's a massive change underway at the moment. It all stems from what's called the Health and Social Care 2012 Act, and this was brought in by this coalition government with no real democratic justification.
You tried to change the bill in the House of Lords, is that right?
I did, yes. It had very little effect. I mean, we didn't actually make much inroads into. They have a big majority in the House of Lords, they have a big majority in the House of Commons. When the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party all work together, then they manage to have a majority. So it was driven through, despite the fact that David Cameron and the government in opposition said in government he would not have another large top-down reorganisation. The NHS has been more or less reorganised to death. The politicians can't keep their itchy fingers off it. And but this is an ideologically driven marketisation of the health service. Now, I'm married to an American, and so I go to the States quite a lot. I also worked in the States. Many things I admire about American life, but believe me, their health service is not one of them.
No,
they have some of the very best medical and surgical centres in the world, and they also have some of the very worst healthcare. What Obama's trying to do, in my view, is very helpful. It will take ages before they have, for all their citizens, a standard of healthcare that a country as rich as theirs should have. And one of the problems is that resources are allocated in a very haphazard, fragmentary and market-driven way. And the National Health Service comes out on top in almost all global comparisons of healthcare in the world. And yet here we are in this country, dismantling it, going back, spending far less money than the Americans, and yet importing their market system. And if, which I hope doesn't happen, but if the Conservatives win the next election, the National Health Service, as we have known it since 1948, will be completely transformed. This isn't a minor change. This is a very fundamental, ideological driven decision to introduce a market in healthcare, despite the fact that every objective evidence is that markets don't work in healthcare anywhere near satisfactory.
And you said in one of your interviews that actually the government, they're trying to privatize NHS because you said that the values will be soon out in the market. Have you got something to prove it?
Well, you have to see the sort of insurance-based model, which is what they're aiming for, which is basically in America. Premiums vary. You can have a big premium and it'll cover you from more or less every eventuality. As I say, Obama Healthcare is trying to improve this, and that will be a big element of improvement as it spreads more across the country. But there's still, you know, they spend 14 to 15% of GDP on healthcare. We spend 9 if you're very optimistic, including private and public. I mean, you have to make a decision in government how much you're going to spend on healthcare, but it's substantially less in this country than many others. And because healthcare is more or less unlimited, it's rationed, basically. Now, who does the rationing? Is it what you can afford to pay, the market, or is it a broadly democratic structure? The NHS is decentralised, a great deal of decisions are taken outside, remotely the control of the Secretary of State for Health. But at the end of the day, the feeling in the country is, and rightly so, that there is a democratic control. You can appeal, you can, if you disagree with what's been done, there'll be debates at every level, and particularly in Parliament, and you can take your case to the Secretary of State. I think this has meant that the health service will remain very popular, because despite everything, people understand that it's rationed. People understand that there is virtually unlimited amount of money to spend on health. But they feel that the British system is broadly fair. It isn't absolutely totally fair. People talk about a postcode lottery. There are differences in different parts of the country. But overall, it's broadly fair, and it tries to discriminate those elements that are underfinanced, get better financed, those elements which need more money, those areas which need more research. I mean, it is tried to plan it in a sensible, logical way, fragment the whole thing, have many different providers, many different companies involved. You won't have anywhere near the coherence that we've grown used to. And people know it. I mean, these popular reforms that this government introduced are coming unstuck at a very rapid rate. It's a race between whether everybody in the country will realise what's happening to the National Health Service before
Yes.
May 2015,
Yes.
or whether they'll wake up in 2016 or 2017. But I mean, those who work in the health service know it is being demolished, literally, as they go about their business.
And I was looking at the rankings the other day, and the UK, at the top, even ahead of Germany and France.
Yes, this is a research organisation in the United States called Commonwealth that looks at, if you like, the commonwealth of the countries, and it compares healthcare systems. And the British National Health Service has consistently come out one of the highest, in fact the highest. There are many different ways of varying it. And we have problems. I mean, we have not been able to deal with the epidemic of obesity. I mean, obesity is a very big issue in British health. We've been fairly good about smoking, not as good as I would like to see, and still quite a lot of people seem oblivious to the risk. But our biggest problems are still some public health issues, drinking amongst young people, very common unfortunately, and very obvious evidence of liver failure in later life. And despite binge drinking goes on. So these preventative health is crucially important, and particularly if we're going to try and limit overall cost. But nevertheless, through all the different statistics, the British healthcare system comes out very well. And yet it has been massively reorganised. I mean, you know, there are lots of other things the coalition could have done. There are a lot of other areas in our life which, in my view, do need turning upside down and reorganising.
Yes.
But the health service was not one of them. But it's driven by ideology, and it started under Tony Blair and the Labour government. And the key issue will now be at the next election whether Ed Miliband, as leader of the Labour Party, tries to reverse this, and I'm pretty confident they will, and I think good luck to them, and I'll help them if I can.
To change. And I don't know if yesterday you watched Prime Minister Question Times, they talked about over NHS, and the two parties, they were blaming themselves. Conservatives, they were blaming Labour for the actually chaos that they left in the Welsh health system. And then on the other side, Labour Party, they were blaming Conservatives for the current chaos that we got in NHS in England. So, so which party do you agree with?
Well, we have one of these big health trust charities in this country. It's just done a comparison of 4 health services in Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland, and they show that actually, as yet, they're not very great big differences. And so this is politicians speak. The objective evidence is that as yet, but mind you, this time bomb of these changes only really, the Act only came into being in 2012. They're going fairly slowly in some areas,
yes.
But the real power of the Act will come into effect really in 1915, 1916. You'll see its impact then. And by then, I think the comparison will be much more unfavourable. Basically, the structure of the NHS has stayed in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland, and it's England, the English NHS, that is being marketised. Yes. That's broadly what you have to see. It's too early to make really detailed comparisons, but we know enough from market experiments in this country, as well as elsewhere, that they impact adversely outside that particular experiment, and they suck in doctors, nurses from other areas. They will distort priorities and make it much harder to get an overall coherence. This is a split, The Conservatives always opposed the health service. They opposed it when it was established. But then in government, they seem, this is the big change, they seem to broadly accept the health service. So for many years, even under Margaret Thatcher, the health service was not substantially dismantled. it's an extraordinary thing. You have a coalition government. Therefore, that means Mr. Cameron didn't win the election. I mean, he has to form a coalition because people were not prepared to give their trust to either the Conservative Party or Labour or the Liberal Democrats. And they seize with as having actually said they're not going to do something, they do it. It's like school, university fees, which the Liberals pledged themselves they were never going to do. They go in and do it. And the Tories convinced themselves they wouldn't do the NHS. Now, is there any wonder that there's cynicism in politics and public service is denigrated? People feel that you can't trust them further than you see them. They're all liars. They're all in it for themselves. There's a huge backlash against this sort of thing, and we've got to try and convince the next generation of politics and people who start the government in 2015 that levelling with people, being straightforward, is a far, far better way. And I hope myself that Labour will learn the lessons, and I think they have learned the lessons of the Blair government, and I think there is a good chance that they will come in with more modest, more changes which I would say would go with the grain of society, and provide a period of sustained, reasonably good government. They're not going to have it easy. I mean, the financial problems are still with us. We have got quite a long way before we can say that our finances are really sound. We're getting some growth at long last, largely as a result of devaluation. Fortunately, we're not in the euro, so we've been able to devalue. And devaluation works. And it's beginning to work in our economy. Good, excellent. But we've got quite a long way to go.
No, and yes, you're right. But what's the problem, Lord Owen? Because is it the financing which is which had affected the current situation of NHS? Is it the financing that we put money, but without actually managing the money? Do you think it's a problem of management rather than just financing it?
Well, we had a global economic crisis. It started in Britain in 2007,
yes,
and it built up globally through 2008, 2009. The world took measures, initially quite good coordination. Gordon Brown, who gets pretty extensively criticised, in fairness, as Prime Minister, did try to stimulate a global response and learn the lessons of past world crises, particularly the 30s. And initially it looked as if that would be our main response. It would be a coordinated global response, so we'd managed to retain some growth. Then you had this Eurozone collapse, really. And that has been very damaging for the world economy and for all of us in Europe. Britain can't insulate itself totally from it, but thank goodness it would never do under the euro. Because it was so obviously flawed. This was a project which you didn't require to be. I'm not a trained economist. You can't go into politics without trying to teach yourselves economics. But trying to objectively look at the Maastricht Treaty, it seemed to me it was bound in terms of the single currency to fail, because they didn't have the mechanisms that you need, which you have in a sovereign nation, to control the impact of an economy across your nation as a whole. So you can have financial compensation for poorer regions. You can alleviate some of the harsher impacts of the economy and regions that are more disadvantaged. None of those powers existed in Europe, and so Greece landed itself in huge difficulties, to a large extent the responsibility of the politicians. Greece, a country I'm very fond of, should never have gone in. I actually went to Athens a couple of times in conferences organised by the economists and warned them, do not go in. But it was a blind European initiative which people felt they should go into. They admitted countries who were not ready to it. If the Eurozone had been confined to the strong German-led economies, Germany, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, they would have been able to deal with it. If they built up the Eurozones very slowly, with financial disciplines, maybe it could have succeeded. But by rushing in and not having all these regulatory controls had a terrible effect. Huge youth unemployment in Spain, Portugal, Greece, huge deficits in Italy, collapse in Cyprus. It's not solved yet even, so it's dragging us back. The Americans, I think, have broadly speaking corrected their banks and the distortions in their own housing market which had contributed to it. But the world economic crisis it's certainly better, and I'm rather inclined to say it is recovering. But there are still out there quite a lot of unknowns, and not least in the European banking business. So it's hard to be sure that we've actually come through this. But the effect of the Eurozone collapse on the British economy has been fairly considerable, because we've lost some markets. But because we're price competitive now, we are beginning to go into those export markets. So I think that we will sustain our growth for at least another year. But the housing bubble that's there needs watching very carefully.
And you talked about the euro. As you know, Mr. Cameron, he got rejected to stop Mr. Juncker to become the president of the European Commission. How strong do you think David Cameron's negotiating position is?
Well, on the issue, who should be the president of the Commission, I think he is correct. I think the president of the Commission has to serve the Parliament, it has to serve the Council of Ministers, and it has to serve the citizens. And I don't think that that can be an automatic choice of the largest group in the European Parliament, which is what has effectively happened. Now, his problem was that the wording that was accepted by the Blair government in the Treaty of Lisbon on the choice of the candidate is opaque, or obscure, which is the way the Europeans work. So it was crafted in a way that those who wanted all decisions to be taken by the European Parliament thought they gained an advantage, and those who thought that the real responsibility for choosing would remain with the European Council of Heads of Government also thought they'd gain. And this fudging of the issues and forming of wording, which is eventually decided by the European Court of Justice, which is not really a court of law that we would admire in this country, and basically makes political judgments towards a federalist solution. They have triumphed on this first occasion. So I think Cameron was right to reject it. And referendums if they think they can win them. It's pretty axiomatic of political behaviour. I've been down that road myself.
No, you're right, and mostly because of Eurosceptic conservative backbenchers that he can't satisfy them.
Yes, there are people who in Parliament who've never been in favour of the European community as it initially was, common market before that. I'm not in that group. I've always thought that things like world government are idealistic, so the UN is a compromise, good organisation really, built in with a veto system without which President Roosevelt and certainly Stalin would never have signed up to. We're fortunate by history, we're a veto power, but we need to have now more of the larger countries permanently represented on the Security Council. We need to check that. That's a good, active organisation. It isn't based on countries being democracies. You live with each other. It's not ideal. The next step towards a sort of more world government, if you like, a more idealistic notion of international cooperation is to build cooperation in different ways in regions. Therefore, the European is a natural thing. You try and develop a structure and a system whereby you get as much agreement as you can within your own region. Very good. I don't see anything against that. But it is developed driven by people who look across the Atlantic, people like Blair, who want to be president of the UK and want to be president of the European Council. They want a big mass to model the United States. And let's be honest about it, that's what they really are after. They would like Britain to have the same freedom within the United States of America as California.
Yes.
They want to have a structured European government. They deny it, of course. In Europe, they tend, on the continent, they tend to be much more open about it. And Juncker, the new President of the Commission, is quite overt about it. He wants to have a basically United States of Europe. Of course, if challenged now, he says he doesn't want that. But we know that that's what his overall dream is. It's a perfectly reasonable aspiration. I don't share it, but I understand, given the language of which the European community was first established, it left open the vista of where you're going. Well, that's, you live and let live. You have to allow people to have dreams, and their dreams are federalist dreams. My dream is of a more coherent Europe without pretension, that openly agrees when it can agree and doesn't pretend it's got an agreement or a common foreign policy. I would never accept that you could have a degree of unity whereby the decision to go to war could be taken on a qualified majority vote. So foreign policy, in my view, can never be decided by a qualified majority vote, because it goes to the basis of whether or not you're going to defend your own country, and that is a sovereign national decision. The other elements of unity, well, we can argue about and agree, but we're getting very close to the limit. And these people don't like limits. They don't like limits being set. Now, in good piece of legislation the government, this coalition government introduced, is that we can't now take any steps to reduce our national decision making without a referendum. And I think that's a sensible use of the referendum. It's a check. And the politicians who want to go off to Brussels and make these deals in the middle of the night are actually now got to come back to the British electorate before they make any significant decisions. And that's almost enough. And in our referendum, well, that will be decided by the electorate. Broadly speaking, I think at the moment there is not a settled will to get out, but there's a settled will to have a referendum. What will happen after that? Who knows?
Very interesting. So now it seems that you're in favor of a referendum in 2017 if Conservatives,
No, I'm not in favour of it in 2017. I don't think anybody should commit themselves. I am in favour in principle of a referendum on the question of whether we stay in or out. I think that is a settled will of the British public. Whether it should take place in the next Parliament, 2015 plus. Ed Miliband clearly does not want to have the commitment. Why does he not want to make a commitment? Because he's afraid of a referendum in circumstances in which the Tories have lost the election. They go ape, if you like. They choose some right-winger who wants to come out, and they harry a new Labour government on this issue to the extent that it completely dominates their agenda, and they can't get on with many of the other things which he considers more important, amongst which he accepts there should be reform. Cameron, on the other hand, because his party is totally split, has to give them a commitment that he will have a referendum in out. But he then hastens to add, but I intend to argue to stay in. And then somebody says to him, but you're meant to be arguing the case for the British reform. Yes, so he fudges this issue. But he's actually, and of course everybody knows, who've lived through this first referendum in 1975, that he aims to do what Harold Wilson did. Yeah. Harold Wilson bound the wounds of the Labour Party up over Europe, and he and Callaghan, who was Foreign Secretary, with my full agreement and understanding, went in, made some changes, not very substantive changes, but gave a gloss to them that they carried more than they did, and won hands down a referendum. But they never committed to the date of that referendum until they'd had the negotiations. They could see the opinion polls and they knew they were going to win. Now, but the electorate senses Cameron, without all his bluster and pledges and everything like that, actually intends to do exactly the same thing. And that UKIP attack him for that, and they carry conviction, because most people believe that's what happened. So we're all being conned by all these different politicians on this issue. People haven't gone straight to the British electorate on Europe for many years.
Many years.
Many years.
But in 1975, when first British, they had a voice if they wanted whether to stay or not. But you resigned in 1975. Why did you?
No, I didn't resign in 1975. I resigned in 1972 when we, first of all, 69 of us Labour MPs voted to go into the European Community, which is a decision I don't regret. I was always in that section of the Labour Party who were afraid of the long-term dream of the United States of America, and it was symbolised by Hugh Gaitskell, who was our leader in 1962, who warned on television about that. Yeah. So I've never been a federalist in the sense, there have always been limits to my Europeanism. But I am nevertheless a convinced European, and I have held that course. I've been a reformer. I have helped change some significant parts of the European Union. I didn't like the Treaty of Lisbon. I felt that we were deprived of a referendum. Again, they were promised one, Blair promised one, Cameron promised one. I haven't done it. Yeah. Now, there are limits to how much you can go on hoodwinking, and so this background of scepticism, this background of feeling that the country is being taken away from this building up all the time, and UKIP are very cleverly working on that. And these things happen in politics. It's not an abstract theory, it's a practical reality. If UKIP are going to take more votes of you than you can afford to let go, you have to adjust yourself to UKIP. So we will see. At the moment, rather bravely in my view, Ed Miliband is defying UKIP's demand for an in-out referendum. And Cameron is going on with it. That's the basic thing. It'll be a pretty dirty election, this next election, because we all know when the date of the timetable, there'll be large sums of money pushed. And who knows? It's very hard to tell. I hope myself that the electorate will look at the flash of Cameron and look at the promises and look at the overall record and decide that they would like to have a government who will be more committed to doing things about unemployment, more committed to raising the minimum wage, more committed to reversing these adverse changes in the National Health Service, and more committed to an educational system that is not driven by the ideology of someone like Gove. You know, he's an able guy, and I don't totally disagree with some of the concepts that lie behind giving a school more control of its destiny. But it's again ideologically driven, and you know, we see this now in some of these schools, these religious faith schools. You can't run all schools through Mr. Gove in the Department of Education. You've got a form of local government out there, and yet none of these people trust local government. We have to go back to giving more powers to local government and more understanding, hold them more accountable for the rates and the taxes effectively they raise. But we're a very, very centralised country. So I hope we're seeing a change. The red top newspapers, I think, have become less important. I think the hacking and state of the newspaper industry has made people very much more cynical about this. I've never been totally convinced that it was the Sun that won it, you know, this claim was that these newspapers. My constituency, all I know is, I used to watch them coming into the Dockyard Gate when I was putting out leaflets in an election campaign. And I know well-known communists who were buying the Express newspaper in those days, a very right-wing newspaper. Why were they doing that? Because of the racing tips. And politicians get themselves frightfully upset about all these newspapers and what they're saying. The average English person, Welsh and Scots, they're fairly savvy. I believe the elections have been correct all my life, every single election, and I've been kicked out twice. I didn't like it at the time, and I didn't think we should have been. But I think we were, on balance, the electorate were correct to kick us out in 70 and in 79.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very salutary for you. The ministerial car doesn't arrive next day, and you're out on your own fighting. But you have your strength, which is your own constituency. And in my case, I was in Parliament for 27 years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've got no complaints at all about a political life. I don't take the House of Lords seriously, but nor does it deserve to be. It's a completely appointed thing, and you know exactly who's been appointed because of how much money they gave a political party, or because they know George, and so it's sort of patronage and everything like that. A second chamber needs to have more legitimacy than we have at the moment. That needs to be reformed. It's vast. Over 800 people, there's not sitting room for it. And the House of Commons needs to be reformed. But above all, the reform must be in a change of behaviour from people in public life. And broadly speaking, they should tell the truth, and damn sight more often than they do.